Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another week of the Daily French Show in sunny South Africa. I'm your host, Nicholas Lorimer, and today I'm joined by Mr. Terence Corrigan. Terence, how are you?
I'm okay, Nick, and yourself?
I'm pretty good, nice and close to the end of the year, so I'm very much looking forward to that. I'm also joined today by Makone Maja. Makone, how are you doing?
Hello. Couldn't be in better company, but yeah, glad to be back.
Oh, shucks.
honest.
Excellent stuff. Okay, let us get into the news of today. And I think the first thing we need to talk about is one of those topics that's not very sexy, but this is fast becoming an ever greater crisis. So, of course, all South Africans are familiar with the great lodestone around our necks, the great burden, the way we feel infrastructure costs the most, which is through load shedding, the fact that our electricity infrastructure has just not been kept up to standard over the years. So not only do we have load shedding, but pretty much all metros suffer, at least to some degree, from prolonged power outages, which have nothing to do with load shedding. But the other infrastructure challenges we have, or problems we have, are fast becoming an even bigger issue. So there was an article recently called "How Transnet is Killing the Economy." And it talks about just how serious the infrastructure problems in South Africa are getting, particularly to do with our rail system, our ports, and our roads, which are, of course, vital for moving around goods around the country. And these are constraining economic growth. The situation with our ports is getting particularly bad. Rudy Dix, who's in President Ramaphosa's office, is supposed to be leading his reform efforts, admits that the situation with our port and road and rail infrastructure is, quote, fast becoming unsustainable. We recognize the problem and the scope of it. The congestion has been building up over time, he said. And what congestion is he talking about? Well, he's talking about major congestion at Durban Harbour, where ships can wait on average 19 days to be unloaded. The Cape Town Harbour, which has got similar numbers of waiting. In fact, it's gotten so bad that one of the world's biggest shipping companies has decided that it is going to, in fact, bypass Cape Town. It would normally sort of stop off at Cape Town, and now it's just going to do the unloading it needed to do around Africa in Mauritius. And then any goods headed for South Africa will be moved in smaller vessels, so we won't get the same big cargo containers. At the same time, we've got all sorts of chaos on the roads. We've talked at length on the show about the damage that's been done to the rail infrastructure over the last couple of years, particularly during the lockdowns when large chunks of rail infrastructure were just straight up stolen. The actual tracks were stolen, especially in the cities. And now we've got increasing problems on the roads. Most recently at the Limbombo border post, there was fighting between truck drivers and taxi drivers. It's not entirely clear to me what the causes of all that were. 2 patrol vehicles were torched, and that disruption caused a 37-kilometer queue up to the border post. Of course, at the center of all this is the misfunction, the dysfunction of Transnet, which is supposed to be operating our ports and rail services. The collapse of the rail network has caused overuse of the roads, which then has led to these kind of high stakes fighting over who controls the routes and who gets to be employed to be the drivers on these routes. You've got sort of mafias trying to hold people to ransom by blocking roads and looting trucks and that kind of thing. You've got the damage to the road infrastructure, and now you've got this fast developing crisis with the ports. An expert interviewed for this article said that there has been the Transnet Ports Authority has shown no foresight or leadership in being able to assess what is happening and what the results would be. They did not take necessary steps to reduce flows, either through scheduling deliveries or meet port loading abilities, or create stacks or place pressure to resolve the crisis. And basically, our logistics system across the whole country is in chaos. So, Makone, let me start with you. What do you make of all this? I mean, obviously the costs to the economy are pretty great, but what does that actually mean in real terms to ordinary people?
Yeah, so Nick, this has actually been dubbed the second biggest economic growth constraint, second to Eskom, of course, but I think it's fast becoming number one. You would have seen the World Bank Container Performance Index rank 2 of our ports near the bottom, right? So the Durban port has been ranked at 341 out of 348 ports, and Cape Town follows about 3 spots at 344 out of 348 ports of the world. And I think just given a lot of the constraints at the port terminals, you'll see them descend lower than what they currently are. I think Transnet is in charge of far too much. And you touched on that a bit earlier when you referred to cable theft crime, because there you have that's in the scope of Transnet freight rails scope of work. And then you also have Transnet Port Terminals, you have Transnet Port National Authority. They just have way too much going for them. And even attempts at privatization where you saw them invite the ICTS, the International Container Terminal Services, that's that Philippines company that's bought a minority share into one of the container terminals. It is the DCT Pier 2, the Durban Container Terminal Pier 2. That agreement, we became aware of it earlier during the year, but it still hasn't been finalized because of a lot of bureaucracy and red tape in ushering the ICTC into managing or co-managing that container terminal. I think you'll be seeing a lot of attempts at privatization following what we're seeing right now, because again, our logistics our economy hinges so greatly on the ability of logistics to function, to be reliable, to be efficient, especially now when the demand is so high going into the Christmas season. So I think you will be just touching specifically on the Cape Town constraints there, where they're describing cranes and how cranes are not working. That's not even because of pressure in terms of too many imports coming into South Africa. That's solely because our infrastructure is old and it's unreliable. It's endured a lot of wear and tear, and there's just so little maintenance going into those container terminals, even at container terminals, but also port terminals. So I think what you will be seeing is either a lot of companies have adjusted to this, which you tend to see people become more and more resilient to state failure. So I believe there was an article released last week where this journalist went asking a bunch of retailers, how are you managing with all the constraints at ports? And they said, well, we had already taken that into consideration and made orders for Christmas way ahead of time. But where those measures had not already been taken into account, I think you'll be seeing a lot of empty shelves at stores coming this December, because again, goods are not able to make it into the country. Where they are able to make it into the country, it'll be very expensive, because instead of using the sea modality, they'll be using air. And that, of course, is far more costly. So again, one way or another, the consumer will be punished, whether it's paying higher for the goods, because those costs of shipment or flying goods into the country are being pushed onto the customers. All those goods are just simply not available. And if it's not in December, because these things tend to have a knock-on effect, but that knock-on effect it's not immediate. You'll see it take place next year.
I believe in that examination of the ports around the world where we ranked so lowly, that ranked us below places like the Maputo harbor. And if you know anything about Mozambique, it is not a well-run or well-resourced country. So the fact that they are managing to surpass us in terms of the efficiency of their port is shocking. Terence, firstly, just kind of your thoughts in general on this topic, but also, Makone talked about the private public partnerships that have been proposed for both the rail systems and the ports. We've seen these kind of kicked around a bit and experimented a bit with, and many people are very excited. I mean, I've talked positively about those in the future, but there's also, I suppose, the problem that you can kind of just create a sort of cozy crony relationship if you structure those deals in such a way that only politically favored companies get them, and then you don't really solve the problem. What do you make of all this?
Yeah, well, this has actually been an issue on South Africa's radar since the 2000s. If you think about it like this, I just did a quick search, and apparently to get cargo from China to South Africa takes about 25 days. If you're having to sit, waiting for 19 days to offload, you can almost do the entire round trip, and that's before you've taken into account, sailors wanting a bit of shore leave to drink alcohol and visit houses of ill repute and whatever else they're going to be doing. Sailors or sailors. Um, yeah, so no, no, this is catastrophic. Remember, South Africa also has an economy that depends on its ability to access the outside world. Just on the question of Mozambique, a little historical allusion there is that in the days of the Zuid-Afrikaanse Republiek, the Paul Kruger's government actually tried to get a kind of deal with the Portuguese to use that so they could bypass British-controlled ports. I think actually there is a very strong case for more regional integration, and that's in that sort of to make that sort of thing work. But that isn't going to solve the problem. You need all of these ports to work better. Now, I think that you touch on something that even for those of us who tend to have a more or less sympathetic view of the private sector and private participation, remember that the business people, and let's say sometimes business people, can be complete shysters. Look, I mean, the point about being in business system is to make money, and God bless you for that. But and a cooperative relationship between the business community and the government is an asset. When it becomes too cozy, it becomes collusion. And I think, unfortunately, what the system that South Africa has created is one that is just ripe for collusion. The whole cadre deployment mess. That was in part explicitly designed to put ANC placeholders in business so that they would always have a sort of ready supply of money. So there's always the danger that you're going to commit 50 billion or whatever it is to upgrade your harbors, and it's being handed out to a businessman who let's say for whom the transit of goods is very much a secondary, if not a tertiary, consideration.
So, Makone, how do we get out of this mess?
Well, you actually touched on it a bit through the private-public sector collaborations, which I'm not actually very optimistic about, unlike you, Nick, sadly. I attended a seminar recently where there were various public sector stakeholders, as well as members of the National Logistics Crisis Committee. And one of the questions I asked was, well, given that a lot of what's happened at Transnet took years and corruption was a huge part of that, how do you plan on, should you proceed with those partnerships between the government and the private sector, how does the private sector plan on holding the government accountable? So what are the terms of play here for private sector in order for them to get involved? Because there's many ways in which public sector can get involved. There's the ICTC way, which is buy a stake in Transnet, but there's also, I believe you'll see a lot of companies that are based in South Africa looking to provide immediate relief, which is short term, but in the long term, I think will do us more harm than good, because then the government never actually gets to interface with the dire consequences of their actions if the private sector just bails them out. So I asked, what do you plan on doing when entering into these partnerships as a private sector, which John usually speaks about and says that they need to be context makers instead of context takers. And they actually quickly ended the webinar and said that time had run out, despite the fact that there were 15 minutes left for them to answer that question. So I think there's a lot of hesitation from private sector to drive the public sector out of the way, out of these conversations, by even proposing ways in which they can enter these agreements with the ability to hold the public sector accountable. At the same time, when they do bail them out and provide that immediate relief, it'll last a couple of hours. It'll last this and the next Christmas season, but long term, it's only going to erode these state-owned entities in the public sector even further. because the government, again, never has to deal with the consequences of their actions, knowing that the private sector is desperate to make a quick buck this Christmas season by bailing the government out.
So as far as I'm concerned, the core of what makes a public-private partnership work is actually when the politics of the country are responsible, and when there's a responsive to the public. So in other words, if the government hires and fires companies based on who can do the best job, not who is the most politically connected, and if the government ignores that they themselves get punished by the voters, by the populace, through protests, through court cases, through voting, that's actually the key here. So I think fundamentally, until we fix kind of the larger political problem, all of these things are sort of imperfect solutions to our problems. Speaking of voting, let us talk about the registration weekend, which was this weekend, when the IEC was at voting stations across the country looking to get as many people as possible registered to vote for the next election. Now, the IEC say that they managed to surpass their target to register 1 million people, which is pretty good. I couldn't find the numbers for the 2019 registration drive, so I'm not actually sure how that compares, but I do think it is higher. Also, a lot of people for the first time registered online through the IEC's website, with 40,000 just on Sunday alone using the online portal to register. I think over 100,000 people registered on the IEC's website, which is a pretty high number for the IEC, although they did have a significant number of people who got sort of technical error messages that gave them a sort of pending, your registration is pending, but then wasn't ever resolved. So they say they're working on fixing that. Why is this important? Well, firstly, we don't know if there's going to be another registration weekend. Sometimes there are two before an election. Sometimes there's just one. Once the election's date is proclaimed, you cannot register more people. So it's very important that anyone who intends to vote makes sure that they get registered this as soon as they can, because we don't actually know if this is going to be the only registration weekend or if there'll be another one. Terence, what do you make of this? I think, there's this horrific cliche in political analysis, particularly in a close election, which is to say, well, it's all going to come down to turnout. But I think in this case, that's kind of very true. Whichever party manages to turn out its voters at a higher proportion is going to really be able to clinch this election, considering that it is looking closer than ever.
Yeah, look, the way it works, I understand, is basically DA supporters tend to come out more aggressively than ANC supporters, and that differential can result in a difference of a good few percentage points. I actually went by the local registration station just to check on my registration. So people, you need to register and vote. It seemed to be functioning quite efficiently. The IEC staff were friendly, if not, I suppose when you've been there the whole weekend, your nerves are going to be a bit frayed. It didn't seem to be overrun with interest, but it seemed to be going about their business well. And I think that I must say that I've said this since I was old enough to vote, and that would have been 1992, the first time that I was able to cast a ballot. That if you are concerned about the direction your country is taking, this is in a democracy, it's a wonderful thing. This is a way you can register an objection. You can you can try to set things right.
Makone, what do you make of this? I think one of the very big questions, because when you do polling on the elections, one of the things that can really make the polls go wrong is when you get the turnout. So kind of working out what the turnout is going to be is very important for working out what the overall result is going to be. What do you make of this?
Yeah, that's true. Polling methodology can often get in the way of the poll results or the reliability of the polling results themselves. But I, as a true millennial, did not bother going to any of the registration sites. I did everything on my phone in the comfort of my home, which is still an alley for people to go about their voter registrations. I think mine is to invite people to the IRR's polling webinar. I believe it's going to be delivered this Friday. I stand under correction, Terence. And you walk away with some very interesting insights about at least the temperature of the political climate amongst the regular South African citizenry from the polling results themselves. Just to give a little bit of a tease, we asked very direct questions about who people would vote for, which politicians people view favorably, somewhat favorably, unfavorably, neutrally, and politicians which are unfamiliar. And that's not just restricted to leaders of political parties. You have people like Chris Pappas featuring in those polls. So he's not exactly president of the DA, but we still found it would be interesting, I think, to ask people how they perceive him, because he's a rising star in politics. At least that's how it looks from people like us who read the media on a daily basis. But yeah, I wasn't very impressed with how rushed it felt these voter registration campaigns were done. It almost felt like they were haphazard. I just woke up, got on Twitter one day, and at 5 p.m. there was an advert rushing me to register to vote within the next 2 days. And I thought, well, you've surely had all year to prepare for this. Why does it feel like there was not much effort taken into this? And I'm not surprised when I see Moonchild, for example, talk about how she didn't see anybody at the registration stations she drove past. I saw a bunch of news articles about that as well. So I'm glad that Terence at least managed to see people queuing up for registration stations in his neighborhood. I am worried, though, that the haphazard nature in which this was carried out will mean or inhibit actual voter turnout. I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I wonder to what extent is that deliberate? Because we know how low voter turnout, who it benefits the most.
Yeah. So I think it is important for everyone to check on the IEC's website, their voter registration stuff. It's probably going to be a little bit congested the next couple of days. With regards to the rules for where you can vote is a little bit more relaxed when it comes to a national provincial election. Usually, as long as you're in the right province and the right, as long as you're within the right province and you are registered somewhere, the system will allow you to vote on both the provincial and national ballots. But it's always a good thing to be registered because you kind of, and I must say that I personally really love voting. It's one of my nerdiest favorite activities, but it's the one day when sort of everyone can go and you're all equal and you all stand in these queues and it's a great moment of civic virtue as far as I'm concerned. So I don't know how many other people on the planet are like that, but if you also want to share in that joy.
Actually, if I can just chime in there, there's been a lot of attention given to absentee ballots or whatever, mostly because we're all vicarious Americans. But I do think that there actually is something to be said for for casting your vote as as a collective, if you will, at a common point in time when presumably you have all had access to the same base of information, to the same arguments, the same experiences, and also the ritual of standing in that line. I voted in 1994. I think that was about 3 hours with a hangover. And
that's the way to do it.
Hangover wasn't so great. But I was younger and better looking then.
All right. Let us, for our final topic now, move on to an article Terence has written, which is on thedailyfriend.co.za, titled "Disincentivizing Reasonable Disagreements." Terence, do you want to maybe take us through a little bit of what you argued in this piece? It's a long piece. It's a very good piece looking into, Terence, why don't you explain?
Well, look, this came out of the report into governance at UCT. Now, as viewers of the show know, I'm not a UCT alumnus, but I actually read that report cover to cover with great interest. Why? Because this is a very rare example of a kind of quasi-official report put together by about a thought-leading institution that took issue with the invocation of race. It talks about Vice Chancellor Pakeng's crass obsession with race and how allegations that she was being subjected to racist treatment lacked merit and whatever. I found this interesting because because I think our public discourse has come to a point where that is often assumed as an axiom. If this becomes a kind of right to be believed moment. Now, as I say, this interested me, but there was also something, a sort of nagging feeling, and in as much as I was old enough to vote in 1994, I also remember that period very well. And I think that it's a mistake just to read a report to read this report and say, wow, she's been caught out, doing a bit of shysterization, because what we have is a discursive and an intellectual culture that has developed since that point, where things like evidence, where things like skeptical inquiry have been sometimes actively dissuaded, where appeals to feelings, to emotions, to theoretical constructs or to historical wrongs. Historical wrongs a big issue, but are often taken as sufficient evidence. And I remember, I went back and I looked at some of my notes and some box files now digitized of media reporting at the time. You would see articles, particularly sort of 90, 95, 96, damning the media, for racism, but often, without citing any sort of specific article or journalist. Just the media is not sensitive to African values being left undefined. We then went into the Mbeki era, where you saw a strain of aggressive nativism coming up. People can remember Dr. Magoba's infamous article where he spoke about white males being dethroned baboons. The article, which I can only attribute this to a genuine desire to be offensive. I think the 2008 investigation into racism in universities, done by a panel of 11 people, 9 people, 7 of whom were either professors or held doctorates. And Gamely said, well, we haven't been able to verify anything, but, there's 140 pages of, horror stories. You haven't been able to verify it, but this is what you want to put forward as a basis for your policy recommendations. But, in a way, there's a very cynical part of me that looked at what Vice Chancellor Pakeng was accused of doing, weaponizing race and whatever, and thinking to myself, actually, she has simply stood within the within the current within the intellectual current that has been created in institutions like UCT. And in a way, she could, I think that she was quite justified in expecting that that this would be received favorably. If it's a case of saying that it's racist to question an allegation of racism, then how dare you? Can one then legitimately talk about a crass obsession with racism? Now, I'm not saying that I personally am questioning this, but I'm saying that there's a whole intellectual climate that has developed to do so. Now, my point is that this isn't just about UCT. As I say, I have no personal links with UCT. I do think it's a priceless national asset. But remember that the damage that is done to an institution like that is in its reputation. And I think that if you want to if you want to turn this around, then you have to look beyond the gates of the university to a civic culture that looks at that accepts pluralism. That doesn't warble on about diversity, which seems to apply to chromosomes and melanin content, but one that actually says, well, we have fundamentally different ideas, and the fact that you hold a fundamentally different idea does not make you a bad person. Let's discuss them respectfully as adults. But I think every incentive that we've created now has been towards, well, I wouldn't say every incentive, but a whole raft of incentives has been towards making that impossible. South Africa will pay a very, very steep price, and I think UCT already has.
Makone, what do you make of this?
I have enjoyed Terence's commentary on this specific subject. I'm yet to read the article, which I will delve into as soon as this is over. But Terence is shaking his head. I'm hoping that's with approval. But I think he's right. I think this lady was merely exploiting all the incentives that were put in place through wokeism, right? If you are given the opportunity to wave the race card at every chance you have to get out of being held accountable or get out of answering questions about various things, then of course you're going to take advantage of that and walk away with R1 million golden handshake at that, which I if you can't tell, I'm still a bit bitter about. But I agree that the incentives are all there, and she's simply making use of the opportunities that were presented before her. But like Terence said, it is at the great expense of one of the biggest academic institutions in Africa. I think UCT at least constantly tops the rankings of these institutions in Africa. I personally didn't go to UCT. I was at the University of Pretoria, and there too you saw the woke virus infiltrate all spheres of governance. So at the higher levels, but also among students as peers ourselves, you saw a lot of rhetoric just become centered around this false sense of victimhood, which a lot of people got to ride and gladly into the sunset using. But again, it's a very thin veil, and I think that report does a great job of piercing it and just showing that beneath it is a bunch of empty suits.
No, there's something insidiously toxic about the way that this kind of these ideas, this trading in racialism, this rampant identitarianism, sort of infected these institutions, and it was relatively contained at first. I think, not just in South Africa, but in many places around the world. A lot of these silly ideas were very contained to universities for a long time, and then suddenly they sort of leaked out into the rest of the world, and they have. Well, I think that the Peking example is exactly what you get when you embrace these ideas as an institution. It's the sort of inevitable result. It's not like I see we've lost Terence. It's not like a fluke. It's not like just because of the personalities involved. It's systemic, which is a word they're very fond of using. But anyway, that is all the time we have for today. We hope that you found the show interesting, and we will be back tomorrow with the Daily Friends Show. Cheers, everyone, and have a wonderful day.